Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
Let's get this show on the road. Welcome to another episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. And this should be a fun one because we've had, by the way, for the first-time listeners, thank you for giving this a shot. You know, we appreciate you listening and having the opportunity to hear about all the different actors and adversaries that we track here at CrowdStrike. I'm Cristian Rodriguez, Field CTO of the Americas, and I'm here with Adam Myers, the head of our counter-adversary operations team. And on the Adversary Universe podcast, we talk about Tradecraft and what the bad guys are doing across e-crime, hacktivists, and nation-state groups that we track here. We had some great feedback, and folks have reached out to saying, "Hey, we would love some more storytelling on some of the bad guys you've been tracking." There's some amazing feedback on the episode that was released with Sean Henry. Folks were stoked about the law enforcement episode.
Where are you getting this feedback from?
Oh man, people are reaching out on LinkedIn. I'm getting emails. People reach out all the time on LinkedIn. They're like, "Hey, I listened to your episode, and I'd love if you guys spoke about X," right? And the most common theme that has come up has been storytelling on what are the bad guys doing? What have you observed? Are there any wild stories that you can share? And obviously now we have, a special guest speaker who, before we started recording, was asking me like, "How did I end up on this episode?" And so,
my recollection is he was begging to be on a podcast.
Oh wow!
I have like 7 emails.
Very coy, Brody.
You're gonna have to produce those emails, I'm afraid. I mean, can't be losing those on a server somewhere.
Oh wow, that's too funny. But in short, I'd like to welcome Brody Nisbet to the Adversary Universe podcast. He's the senior director of OverWatch, or the counter adversary operations team. And so, Brody, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. I'm a long-time listener, first-time podcaster.
So, Brody, go ahead and just for the listeners, like maybe explain your role here at CrowdStrike, so the folks can understand, the listeners can understand why you're a guest speaker on today's storytelling episode.
What would you say you do here?
What do you say?
Yeah, lots of TPS reports, actually. We just do them in Jira, though. So I'm the senior director of Overwatch globally. I sort of fell into cybersecurity after a career with the Australian government, and have basically come across as an intrusion analyst into CrowdStrike, and over the years worked my way up to where I am today. What I'm doing on a day-to-day, though, is running the Overwatch team, not to put it too complicated. But what that means is overseeing all the threat hunting that gets done on behalf of CrowdStrike underneath the CAO mission that Adam runs in the Intel team, in the Intel world. Okay. So, yeah, directing the 80-plus analysts and 30 or 40 devs in our SCAR research team who I work side by side with. They don't report directly to me, but keeping us all on mission and pointed at the adversaries.
Brody, a lot of our listeners may not necessarily be customers, but some of our listeners aren't fully familiar or acclimated with the services that we provide. So would you mind explaining what Overwatch is and kind of their mission?
Overwatch is CrowdStrike's threat hunting team. Threat hunting is very difficult to define. It's a bit of a fraught exercise given the range of implementations and opinions out there, but that's what we do here. So for me, I don't even really have a full definition of that term. It's just the sum of the activities we undertake to deliver the service. Our mission statement, we do actually have a mission statement. It's quite long and it's backed by a bunch of purpose statements as well. So I'm not going to share it totally, but basically it can be summarized as, and I spent some time on this trying to figure out how to summarize it to a soundbite. And our mission is to outcompete your adversary, is what I came up with. It's our job to basically detect adversaries in customer environments before they can complete their mission on objectives and notify customers of that, provide them with the actionable intel they require to help protect themselves.
I know, like Adam says this a lot, and I've been plagiarizing it, extensively on disrupting the adversary or making it more costly for them to operate. But I like the idea of like outpacing them, outperforming them.
That's a precursor to disruption. So we try and generate. I mean, ultimately, what you get is an email or a trigger, some sort of notification from us. But we try and keep that to a standard where it functions as sort of actionable threat intelligence about something active in your environment now, right? So if we can do that fast enough, we can help generate a little bit of competitive advantage on the side of the blue team, and then that's how you get to disruption.
And it's worth, I think, noting that the amount of data that flows into that process. The last time we checked, it was 5.7 trillion events per day, 65 million events per second, right? So this is, I think the really incredible thing about Brody's team is how much data they're able to just really instantly triage and kind of sort the wheat from the chaff and figure out what's important for the customer. And they're looking at, really hands-on keyboard, which means they're not looking for malware or, the things that you would catch with like antivirus or something like that. They're looking at behaviors. They're looking at, PowerShell and Python and Windows WMIC commands and things like that. So they're really kind of at that rubber meeting the road area for our customers and able to kind of act as that kind of safeguard to help make sure that they don't have a bad day. And it's also really powerful when we work with managed service providers who have partnered with CrowdStrike, because Brody's team, they really are able to do the lion's share of a lot of the kind of triaging and then feed it back to the MSSP so that they can take action and kind of work with their customers. So it's not just something that only benefits from direct customer relationship to CrowdStrike. It's also through our partner ecosystem as well.
Got it. If someone was listening to this episode for the first time and they were just getting introduced to the idea of threat hunting, how would you summarize that, Brody?
With great difficulty. So it looks a little bit different what we're doing versus what maybe a lot of people in the industry who are protecting their own network. The type of threat hunting they do would look structurally different to how we do it, just by virtue of the scale that we have to operate on. We have to we don't casually triage all the data Adam just referred to. It comes with a whole set of workflows and special purpose-built tools that sit on top of our log scale. And so what we do is CrowdStrike has the Overwatch team with about 80-something people freed up for threat hunting. And what that means is they all track 1, 2, 3, or 4 adversaries, depending on how active those adversaries are, how problematic they are. And so it's their job to be responsible for tracking that adversary across the breadth and depth of our customer base. So that means writing the detections, reading reports, consuming the intel that comes out of Adam's team or CAO more generally, open source intelligence, and then understanding them not just through that threat intelligence view, but through our own lens. So it's one thing to read about an adversary, but then you've got to think, well, how am I going to detect that with the patterns and the detections we've got and the tools that I've got? And so they become SMEs for each of those adversaries. And what it means is we can cover about 100, 150 named actors and another 50 plus clusters. And that's kind of our specialty, is to be on top of those active threats, more so than triaging every detection that comes in, which is what you will get from a security operations center, which is totally necessary to actually protect the network as well. Like, the two things have to go hand in hand. Adam mentioned working with partners and managed detection and response teams. Perfect example of that is our own Falcon Complete team. Like, we integrate very, very heavily with them to make sure that our findings roll into them so that they can action it on those customers and vice versa. And for our customers that have their own internal SOCs or MDR teams, or even threat hunters, depending on how they've defined that exactly, we integrate with those quite well too. So threat hunting as we do it is not exactly managed detection and response, and it's kind of also in the service offering. Like, we can't press the buttons for you. right? You have to do that with the intelligence that we give you, or through Falcon Complete or whatnot.
Maybe a good example of how this all works, famous CHOLLIMA, we've talked about this before. I probably told the story before. Brody was the guy that actually called me and said, "Hey, I have this great idea, Wednesday.
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah, I just need a bunch of money and a bunch of people, and we can do insider threat hunting as a service." And I tasked him back, and I was like, "Well, we got to prove that it works." And the next day we got that inbound incident response where a customer was notified by law enforcement that they had hired a malicious insider. And so I called Brody up and I said, "Okay, wait, here's an opportunity. Let's see if your ideas work. And if they work, then we can fund them." And Friday is when he called me back and he said, "I found 30 or 40 more victims, whatever it was." And that was kind of how we ended up. Now I think we catch, last year I think we caught like 700 instances of famous CHOLLIMA getting remote IT jobs. So that's kind of the process, I think is really important to illustrate. Brody and team came up with a methodology. They came up with kind of a hunting strategy for how you might look for this type of thing. And then they have this huge set of data to go apply that for, right? It's kind of like a playground to go out and start looking at how can we find this? How can we prove this? Here's a theory that we want to test. Mm-hmm. And then as they start to develop that, then they figure out how to mainline that, right? And they figure out what detections can we put back into the product so that they don't have to work on that problem anymore. They can go off to new problem and find something different. And that's kind of the beauty of how the Overwatch team works, is that they're kind of out there. And I think part of it is that they're consuming not just our threat intelligence, but they're consuming open source blogs. They're looking at vulnerabilities. They're looking at all the things happening in the space, and then applying that into their hunting operations and using that to go find interesting new novel things.
I see. So you're tracking all of these adversaries, studying their tradecraft, applying this threat hunting or various threat hunting methodologies to their tradecraft across this very massive data set. I think the listeners want to hear some stories, right? Like, give us a couple of examples of, outside of the famous CHOLLIMA story, which I think is an ongoing issue, and we're going to cover, I believe, famous CHOLLIMA and some other things in future episodes. But tell us a little bit about some interesting attacks that stand out for you that you thought was like really crafty or creative in terms of the adversary's ability to launch an attack and maybe get to a certain point in that stage of an attack.
Before I do that, and because I can demonstrate it with the case to answer your question as well, but the workflow we go through to carry that analysis out is the find, fix, finish loop, F3EAD. So that's just to answer the specific, what tradecraft are you using? The analytic tradecraft is.
You should explain the EAD part since you threw it out there, right? Brody, I have this long-standing thing where he likes to just say find, fix, finish, which this comes from...
It's a lot easier.
Counterinsurgency military doctrine from back in the... started off back in the 80s, I think, with targeting tanks, right? So you find the tank, you fix its location, and then you finish it with ordnance. And then as they kind of tried to pivot that into counterinsurgencies in the 80s, they added exploit, analyze, disseminate. So F3EAD is how it's often kind of shortened, I guess. And so what that means is that when you find something bad, you fix its location, you deal with it, right? Disrupt it or notify the customer, whatever it is. And then you exploit and find additional information, anything that could be useful. You analyze that, and then you disseminate that. And so from a CrowdStrike perspective, Brody's team in Overwatch is really focused on the find, fix, finish part. And then they pair with the Intel team to do the exploit, analyze, disseminate part. And that creates kind of this virtuous cycle of they're finding bad stuff, it's getting enriched and analyzed, and then it goes back to find more bad stuff. And that's kind of the beauty of how things operate here between Overwatch and threat intelligence.
I love that.
Yeah, the magic really happens in the exploit analyze phase. I think that's where we get the most bang for buck, where you pick up learnings live, really nearly sort of within that 1 to 4 hour mark, and then turn them into new detections to go and leverage them straight away.
And I know Brody sent me a wall of text that I didn't read over the weekend about the stories we wanted to talk about. But one I think that's worth kind of highlighting is Operator PANDA, which is also an assault typhoon. And I think this highlights, how we've expanded the aperture of Overwatch over the last year now. So CrowdStrike, isn't just endpoint detection products. We also have identity and cloud and next-gen SIEM. And one of the things that Brody, working with the Overwatch org, has been able to do, they came up with 48 different ways to detect operator PANDA on a lot of legacy network appliances. So maybe Brody, I'll throw that one out there for you to kind of chew on a little bit.
Yeah, operator PANDA is a bit of a curveball because it was, when it came out, when it was released, there was not a lot to work with, and it was not in our primary detection domain on the endpoint. To be honest, it wasn't even in our secondary or tertiary detection domain, like in the identity product or any of the NG SIEM stuff that we had. And so it's a good example of consuming like threat intelligence, open source intelligence, turning it into detections, turning it into findings, because it didn't start with an intrusion that we had access to. We had to build it up. And that F3EAD loop, as we go through our work lifecycle, doesn't just generate new detections, but it drives product improvements as well, which is what we ended up having to do here. So a lot of the work was done outside of, like, it wasn't necessarily a threat hunter that did it. It was completed within like SCAR, our research team, to help come up with novel new ways to use the NG SIEM, data that we can try and use to find operator PANDA. But then we have to like socialize that, like deploy all those patterns and rules, get it out there, and then customers have to deploy it, configure NG SIEM properly, and then they actually have to get hit by operator PANDA so that we can see it. And so, like, it's a bit of a, I'm not sure what the right word is, but
in that case, they also had to wire in TACACs and do all kinds of unnatural stuff. So, but I think that's a kind of cool use case that demonstrates where we had a relatively untractable problem with operator PANDA, that we didn't have good visibility because they weren't on the endpoints. They were targeting, legacy devices. And we figured out, that was a high enough priority for us to kind of close that visibility gap and help our customers, particularly in the telco space, that we were able to kind of engineer a way to collect that data, get it in front of the Overwatch team so that they can now hunt for it.
So, I mean, I think like that's an interesting use case because, to your point, Brody, having access to third-party data to kind of drive, the intelligence to create the patterns, right, was it sounds like it was a little outside of what Overwatch typically does, right? It sounds like the data set that your team primarily works with, and even from the inception of Overwatch, was tied to what was happening on the endpoint and the identity side and in the cloud, right? So now we're talking about getting all this network infrastructure and this gear into the platform.
We do have some form with that because, I mean, every new product that arrives is a new detection domain. So like when the identity product was released many years ago, we were in a similar position. And then when the cloud product came out, and as NG SIEM connectors are brought online for Overwatch, not just for the product for the customer to use, but actually brought to where we can see them. We have to upskill, cross-skill, learn, hit the ground running for all sorts of new stuff that comes in. Not totally unknown. We do handle those things pretty well, I think. I don't want to go back to famous CHOLLIMA in detail, but that's another perfect example of, we've got a data set, a problem that we've just learned about. What does it actually look like in the data we've got? And then we have to find new ways to exploit and use that data to fulfill that new hunting tasking, which is what we did there. We basically repurposed telemetry that we already had from, I think, device control and a few other modules to sort of figure out how we could detect laptop farms with it, for instance. And that's really like a MacGyver job compared to Operator PANDA, which was like doing the job properly, right, with the research team and changing the way the product works and bringing in new data sources and finding out how to use it. So we're sort of capable of doing both as it is required. And
sometimes you have to do both, right? Sometimes you have to MacGyver it first, and then you engage the research team and say, hey, how do we make this less janky?
This problem's not going away. How am I going to do it every day?
Exactly. Yeah. So it's, But I know you had a bunch of stories in that wall of text, so I'll give you some opportunity. He's got a lot of grievances he wants to air here, I think.
Oh, wow. Okay, it's confession time.
No. It's not like that. When I got the brief for the podcast, it was to crib off the that cold case theme, which has apparently been quite popular. And at first, I was like, "Oh, we don't really have cold cases." Like, I spent all that time developing our team to function on F3EAD to sort of work within that 1 to 4 to 2 day to a week loop. But then the more I thought about it, I realized like, oh, we actually do have some
cold
cases that
really?
go on.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got our favorite dessert.
Yeah. And not just cold cases, but sort of adversaries that we have to deal with for very extended periods of time. It's probably more the they really put the persistent in that sort of persistent threat category, even if it's not very advanced all the time. And so I was then thinking about like our workflows, the intelligence lifecycle that we go through still handles that quite well because we're always generating that intelligence, which just lives in our tool set forever and ever and ever. And there's a lot of adversaries that we could talk about. So I decided to pick one that I don't actually know if it's in Fintel or not. So I'm talking about Sly Cathedral, Adam.
Fluffy
which
Cannoli?
was, Fluffy Cannoli.
Is that a real code name? Really?
It was very briefly before it was changed to Sly Cathedral.
It's a wild story though, because I think they spent the years.
Yeah, so so that's the use case. I mean, the reason I like this case is because it appeared, we smashed it in like a week, and then it went quiet for years and years and years and years and years, and then all of a sudden, after 3 years, it exploded again, and in an unexpected way. And so, I think it goes back to May 2020. It's very common for Overwatch to be deployed into a new customer. Right, the sensor gets rolled out, and that customer already has ants, right? Like there's already malware in there. There's some sort of backdoor or whatever, resident in memory or just like more traditional, more clumsy, more obvious methods. Doesn't matter. It's fairly normal. And so this was the case here. We were rolled out into a large international law firm. About 2 months later, an implant came to life. And so this is where Overwatch kind of does quite well too in that post-exploitation activity. Adam alluded to it earlier in the podcast. And it's when an adversary essentially has to come onto a managed host, shell out into the operating system to where we can get a chance at detecting them. And that's what happened here. They'd been there for some time, but because they were there before the sensor, we obviously didn't get to see the deployment, like the exploitation and the front half of that attack chain. But when the implant came to life, we basically saw it archiving files, doing what we call exfil prep. So zip everything up with a neat little command line thing that says, it's got a little date in it. It's like /TA with a date, like take everything that's changed in this folder structure since the last time I was here. And so we're able to sort of infer, if not the last time they were there, at least how far back they were interested in all this lawyer's stuff. And that, for us, in our tool set, that sort of activity really lights up as being of interest, even though it's not malicious as such.
Sure.
Obviously, it's malicious in context, but just using WinRAR in a fancy way is not necessarily bad. So we were able to...
Right? It is an outlier.
It sure is, yeah. And they're known techniques that we've observed in other intrusions, which is why there are patents for it, which is how it gets caught. So we notify the customer that day several times. First of all, hey, is this you guys archiving all this stuff for some purpose nobody here can divine other than sort of malice? And then they were pretty on the ball. From memory, they've got a security team, but I think it was quite small. So they were very much moved to contain. There was no like, we're going to see how this plays out, or, can you give us more information or whatever before we make a decision? It was very much like, turn it off. So they did that. And then they went ahead and actually we didn't ask them to. They just went ahead and grabbed the laptop. They basically had the lawyer send it in a bag. They went full forensics on it and shared a lot of that with us. And so that's good because Overwatch doesn't always get forensic level access to an investigation. We have to work with endpoint telemetry, and some customers just wipe laptop, they'll just wipe the workstation the minute something bad happens, and all that data just goes straight out the window. It's not uncommon.
It's actually one of the my biggest gripe with Overwatch is that they stop so much stuff from happening before it gets to the point that we know what it is. So we actually we cut off a lot of that intel because we prevented the adversary from being successful. So it's good that we're able to stop it, but it's also one of those things I wish we had a little bit more visibility. Just let it go a little bit longer.
Too good. Yeah.
Well, I mean, when the customer doesn't have their contacts configured and no one can figure out how to talk to them, then unfortunately we get to watch intrusions develop a bit longer. But in this case, they were pretty on the ball. And I'm not really sure how active the adversary was. I feel like they'd been getting away with it for some time, and then all of a sudden they were shut out, so they weren't really prepared to sort of get back on. So they brought that malware in, shared it with us, and we Overwatch won't necessarily do intel reversing. We have a pipeline. It's boring, but we've got a nice little logistics pipeline to get files over to the intel team to have them reversed by them, and then they get that information back to us. And that's where the case sort of went from routine to a little bit interesting. So it went through the bounces. It's interesting when
you've got Overwatch, reverse engineers, and general counsel in the same channel.
Yes. The first comments that came back were like, this malware is super weird, and also it's in Power Basic. And I had to Google what Power Basic was. I mean, I had a rough idea, but I hadn't actually heard of it before. I still, to this day, haven't actually researched how it would function necessarily, or why it worked the way it did. I just took the malware reverser's word for it, and the fact that we saw it working. And I think they were also they were using it to just bring in TeamViewer, right? So they were sort of doing lay off the land at least a few years before it was really in the headlines, I think it's fair to say. And just to collect the files and exfiltrate them as if they owned the host themselves and had just decided to log in from somewhere else. So pretty low footprint once they're in, and we don't really know what the entry looked like. So, yeah. So we had disrupted a very targeted, one lawyer, with malware that's very unique, just taking their stuff, but ultimately not that sophisticated in the scheme of things.
But we did attribute it directly to one private sector offensive actor.
Directly. Yeah. So the only other place we ever seen that malware anywhere was in VT, and from an Italian source IP address. So the guy reversing the malware gets to name it. He saw that, Fluffy Cannoli. I don't know what he was thinking, but that's how it is. He's completely unapologetic, so I'm happy to use it on the podcast. He said he'd do it again. So, yeah. But that whole workflow only took a few hours, really, to detect the post-implant file collection and have it disrupted. And then,
but how many years between when we first saw it and when we next saw it? That's the best part.
So that's the thing. We never saw it again for 3 years. It never came up again. I did all sorts of stuff. So when we get a case like this, first of all, we go and start looking at other customers similar. So I actually retasked analysts to go and look at similar law firms. We had a guess at what they might have been after, because we knew roughly who the lawyer was. So we thought, hey, well, I mean, if they're interested in this guy, they might be interested in this sort of thing. So we did what's called just a coordinate search, where we sort of divide up bits of our detection landscape, if you will, for lack of better words. And people will go and look at that more closely under a microscope, especially if you're sort of given hey, go look for law firms for stuff that is old, pre-censor, maybe start looking at the way file archives are happening and blah, blah, blah. I think we did that for a few months on and off. It was very, nothing came of it. And the whole thing was sort of put in the freezer, as it were. for 3 years. So a few years later, 2023, Overwatch has a small team of people who do a little bit of counterintelligence work, basically try and protect our detection equities from our adversaries. So all the work we do for the big part of the day is actually protecting our customers from their adversaries, not ours. We've got our own problems though. People trying to get access to the sensor. Yeah, people trying to get access to the sensor, people testing bypasses, tampering, trying to figure out what we can see, all sorts of stuff.
Mostly like people trying to get credit on LinkedIn for sensor bypass, and
that's probably one of the bane of my role is that stuff. But we catch that while looking for the more serious threats to our detection equities, which is kind of what happened here. So there's a couple different ways to get the sensor. You've got to be a paying customer. You can do trials, you can do POVs through a partner. I think there's 4 or 5 ways to get access to the sensor. I think there's binaries floating around on VT too, but that doesn't really work these days for bad guys. So we had a customer sign up to do a POV, so proof of value for anyone following along at home. But they immediately started testing the sensor's capabilities, which is perfectly commonplace because, I mean, what else would you do in a POV, right? To see if it works or not. But the thing is, there's a very different flavor and fingerprint to testing the sensor to see how it performs versus testing your malware against the sensor to see if it can find you. They're not really the same thing. And without going into too much detail, it's quite possible that we can tell the difference sometimes. Normally when a company, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Normally when a bad guy does this, they register a fake company or a front company, fake business registration, or they copy someone else's. But these guys didn't, for whatever reason. They decided to do it in the clear. And so after chatting with some internal stakeholders and sales engineers, it sort of became clear that it was a real company doing this. And the reason it's interesting is because the Fluffy Cannoli malware was sitting there in dev. They were testing it to see if it would work in new phishing payloads.
Oh, wow.
And I don't know if they'd forgotten that CrowdStrike had caught them 3 years earlier, or it's a different operator, or they never knew, or they didn't care. Yeah, it's all possible, right? Yeah. And it became clear pretty immediately that it wasn't like a blue team guy who's like, oh, I found this, someone tried to phish me, I wondered what it looks like. It was there in dev, we call it, because you can see all the file paths and the folders, and you can see them trying to get it work over and over again, because the sensors evolved quite a lot between 2020 and 2023. Power Basic has not. And that's the other thing. It's so unique that it's just, it's not possible that it was like, it's not plausible that it was anybody else. And so, yeah, we were able to, I don't know if Adam, I'll let you do the honors. I don't know how much you want to discuss of the operator. But basically, they're a group that offers digital investigations.
We track many of these groups as private sector offensive actors, meaning these are PSO companies that have a offensive capability, and they, whether it's lawful in the country that they're operating, or it's lawful for the customers that they're selling it to use it. It's effectively kind of a gray area of a threat actor, but they have, they pay their taxes and they file paperwork for their business.
Commercial offering, basically.
Yeah, it's a commercial offering. So we can leave it at that, but suffice to say, we know which one it is. And, that's been kind of one of the real kind of highlight of that story, though, is that Overwatch found something unique in 2020. They noted it, they looked, they hunted, they didn't find it anyplace else. They kind of said, that's weird. And then 3 years later, it popped back up, and they're like, we know what that is. And they pulled in the Intel team, they pulled everybody together, and instantly we kind of had our understanding of what was going on. So that's just, I think a really interesting story to highlight how Overwatch can handle some cold cases. And I think we had a few more, but we're pretty low on time. We might need to bag that for another podcast where we could talk about one of Brody's favorite suspected Western operators.
I did want to actually clarify something for the listeners, again, just getting acclimated with Overwatch. you talked about Overwatch monitoring tradecraft and then alerting customers to the presence of a bad guy, and then typically you'll have like an MDR service or the customer or enterprise themselves try to contain that. And I wanted to share a quick, 1 minute story on when I first started here in 2015. There was a think tank that was using us in a detection only mode, and Overwatch was in service at this small think tank. And I remember getting a call on a Saturday where Overwatch was saying, "Listen, we're trying to contact what is listed as like the main IT guy at what's basically a 30-person think tank at most, and we cannot find him. We are we're trying to email him. He's not, or we can't email him. Rather, that was a problem. You couldn't email him because the adversary environment was
2015 was a bad time for think tanks.
Yes, it was. And I remember getting a call. And Brody, I'm almost curious. I don't know if it was you, but somebody reached out and said, "Hey, Cristian, could you find this guy physically? Because we just happened to coincidentally be within at least 40 miles of each other, right?"
Yeah.
And I remember like finding this guy. Finding him on LinkedIn, like I did some mega research to finally
popped out of his bushes.
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah, and the objective was, get this company at least like unplug their Exchange server because the adversary is on here right now, and something needs to happen. And I remember that story. I remember I had just started. Maybe I was like 6 months in to the role of an SE. I remember just spending all Saturday trying to find this guy. I finally found him. And I was like, "Listen, do you need me to go there and unplug this for you?" And he's like, No. Like, totally got it. He was like, his kid's like, basketball game or something. And he's like, "I am on my way to the office right now." And then it wasn't until then where I truly realized the power of Overwatch, where, the adversary was that crafty, and the visibility that your team had was just, I think, unprecedented. And you understood the tradecraft, you saw the emails going, and we kicked into high gear. And so, that's a scenario, again, where you're alerting and the customer needs to create an action, right, based upon your recommendations. But we do have services here at CrowdStrike, just to highlight that, where we would do the full remediation and mitigation for you. All right, so just keep that in mind.
And the number of times that they've done that to me, typically it happens on a Friday night where they'll be like, "Hey, like this target, like they're not a customer, but we have evidence that they've been compromised." And now I'm going on LinkedIn and finding some CISO to ruin his weekend. Hey, you don't know me. This is going to sound really weird.
It's going to sound really weird, exactly.
It's like, Call me maybe.
That's fascinating. No, I think we have, again, a lot of listeners that want more stories like this. Our observations, what are we seeing in the background that doesn't make it into the reports that we put on our blog, for example. And I think, Brody, just because we're running up on time, it would be great to get you back here to talk a little more around adversaries that really pique your interest, given their tradecraft and given even some cold cases that you have yet to mention. So we'll have to
sounds good.
ASAP.
There's a couple of good ones in there, so spoiler alert, we'll have to get them back for those.
Yeah, we're gonna do a part 2 where we're just gonna dive right into the rest of these stories, and we also want your feedback if you're a listener. And you have been listening for some time. Again, appreciate the support. We appreciate the listeners supporting us, the new listeners. Thank you for giving us a shot again. Brody, thank you for coming on to this episode of the Adversary Universe podcast. We're going to have you back for another episode. Adam, any closing comments? Because we want more of this, right? We're getting a lot of great feedback, a lot of support.
Let's do it. I mean, like the amount of stories that come out of Overwatch. This is the first time we've kind of opened the kimono a little bit on that, and it didn't disappoint, I hope. So I think this is something we'll do a little bit more of, and I think it's a lot of fun, and we have fun over in CAO and Overwatch, looking at this stuff and hunting bad guys. So little day in the life.
Yeah, day in the life. True. All right, so in the next episode, we'll dig a little deeper into those stories. We'll talk about the subtle and creative, and I guess sometimes even brilliant tradecraft that we're observing. Adversaries that stand out the most to you, Brody, and I would love also your feedback, Adam, on who's a one or two adversaries that really are creative, right? And how do we up our game on stopping these bad guys, especially on the customer side and enterprise side? Like, what else can they do outside of relying on Overwatch? So let's cover that on the next episode. So thank you again, Brody. Adam, great to see you again, and we're going to catch you on the next episode. We'll see you later. Bye.
See you later.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.